is an Augustinian monk, and he just adores Augustine. And when you look at his eschatology, and especially as it even flows on through the Lutheran Church, you'll find again it's very much along Augustine's line, and I've got quotes that deal with that in depth. You come on again through the Reformation. The Reformation did not really regain a new biblical eschatology. It perpetuated essentially that had come on through the centuries. For instance, the Catholic Church in its documents plainly says that the Catholic Church is the new Israel. You go on through the Reformation. Now, there are exceptions again. I've quoted some exceptions. But the general thrust, you'll find, is that it was Augustinian. And really, Reformed eschatology is that which is the inheritance, really, of the whole Augustinian thrust through Luther, Calvin. Calvin, again, is full of Augustine. He loves him, and it goes on. And I've even read some modern writers, and these modern Reformed writers, they boast in Augustine. And on this area of eschatology, I'm saying you shouldn't boast. You should be ashamed, you know.
Well, you refer to contemporary Christian anti-Judaism in the United States and in the UK, especially with regard to those who hold Reformed convictions. I know you already touched on this, but why the emphasis on the Reformed Church?
Well, of course, I guess I've got to confess, Chris, I've got a personal interest, and I'm very much staunchly a sovereign grace man. I'm a Calvinist. I believe in the sovereignty of grace. I will be second to no man in that. But so was C.H. Spurgeon. But he was very much, again, a man basically in support of what I'm presenting here. So mixing in Reform, sovereign grace circles, I come up against this in my reading. And I've read many Reformed writers, different shades of Reformed. You know, in England, you've got their sort of basically got a Reformed heritage anyway, and you've got some vociferous anti-Judaism there. Colin Chapman, Stephen Sizer, even N.T. Wright, probably a little calmer, but he's still in the same camp. You come here in the United States, I think of Palmer Robertson. Now, he's Presbyterian. He's a very good exegete. But when you read his book on this whole matter, the Israel of God, it's plain what he's saying. God's finished with the nation. Gary Burge from Wheaton College, he's the same. Knox Theological Seminary down in Florida. I've quoted them all. You can read all the quotes, and you'll see they're all saying the same thing. Basically, their eschatology is Augustinian, and therefore God is no longer dealing with them as a nation. And that's all over. You know.
Hasn't there been, though, in Reformed history, some very loving attitude and treatment of the Jews among the Puritans, for instance, and the Dutch Reformed, obviously, even in World War II? He had Dutch Reformed Christians risking their lives hiding the Jews in their homes and so forth.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. The only thing I would say is, again, it's relatively speaking, it comes across in the broad sweep of Reformed doctrine, Lutheran, out of Geneva or Wittenberg or even out of Westminster in the Church of England there or over in England. The major thrust is still the Augustinian one. I have quoted, for instance, a very famous Dutch theologian called Wilhelm Brakel, and you read the whole quote there. You can see the man's gentleness, and he has a love for the Jews, and you can see a tenderness there. But you don't see that in Augustine. You don't see that. And even some of the Reformed writers today, you won't see that. Some of them, frankly, some of them in England, I think their attitude is rather shameful. And it shows when you read them,
Does Israel still have biblical rights to the physical land of Israel?
Well, again, we get back to Scripture. The Scripture must be the fundamental base issue here. We can deal with other matters once we deal with Scripture. And the Scripture seems to me plainly says, when you go to Genesis 12, 15, 17, you go on, of course, right through the Old Testament, that God has covenantally, irrevocably given the land to the nation of Israel. Now, of course, you raise the issue of today, and that still, I believe, is a fundamental, non-negotiable issue. Even if they've been dispersed, it doesn't alter the promise. Even if they've been misbehaving, it doesn't alter the promise. because God is eventually going to save them, and Israel will be saved, and they will love Christ as their Messiah.
Where did the Palestinians come to play? The Palestinians, and I use that phrase realizing that the word Palestinian up until 50 years ago was meant to signify Jews, but the Arabs in Israel, do the so-called Palestinians have rights to the land of Israel as a whole?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned a point there that I was going to make anyway.
Okay.
And that is that you go back to the 30s, the Palestinians were the Jews, and the Arabs were called Arab settlers, Well, that's changed. It changed principally particularly after the Six-Day War and then the Yom Kippur War of 1963 onwards, when the Arabs realized, especially the pan-Arab nations, let me make that point very clear, all the wars really fought against Israel have been fought by the pan-Arab nations, not really the Palestinians. But after the 63 and the Yom Kippur War, then there was a change and there was a cry for a nation. There'd never been a cry for a nation any before. And furthermore, they never had a nation, because Palestine originally, it belonged, earlier back it belonged to Syria, and then of course it was part of the Ottoman Empire. When the Second World War was over, Britain had the spoils of that area as well as France, and then it was, of course, finally handed over to the United Nations. But, okay, the question is, do the Palestinians have rights? Of course they have rights. If you say, do they have the right to a nation, the lander, I say no. I don't believe that at all. And they've never had a right like that. They've never had a nation there. But you go back to some of the early Zionist writers, you'll find that they had a most loving interest in the Arabs there if they should possess the land. There are Arab citizens there, Arab Christians there. I grant you that on both sides of the fence there have been some very horrific situations. But nevertheless, they have rights. One point I'd make to you, the Palestinians really do have a land. It's called Jordan. The original plan was that would be their land. They don't receive the Jews into Jordan now, but that's the land of the Jordanians. Now, if you say, yeah, but there they are on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, well, I believe, again, I think, frankly, Israel could run those areas much better than ever the Arabs are, and I think the proof is what you see in the Gaza Strip now. It's horrific what's going on there, So they have rights of human rights. They have citizenship rights, but they don't have national rights. I don't believe that for a moment. And the thing could have been resolved much earlier. For instance, just one example here. Look at India and Pakistan after the British passed over the land to independence there. Well, you have two nations formed out of that. That was resolved. And the Jordanians have a land, and that's, I should say, I'm sorry, the Palestinians have a land, and that's Jordan. Now, there's problems, I know, but the Arabs, the Palestinians, do not have the land. I don't believe that for a moment. And it's a biblical conviction, but it's fundamental to this whole matter.
In what way is Romans 11 significant in terms of your whole presentation?
Well, of course, it is the great passage in the New Testament. This is the classic passage. I mean, if you're dealing with all these issues, you've got to carefully look at Romans 11. I would add a few thoughts on this. Firstly, when you read Romans 11, realize this. You're reading an epistle read by a converted rabbi. Paul is as a Messianic Jew. Mm-hmm. He writes with that background. In fact, he opens up with chapter 11. He says, I too am an Israelite. He doesn't say I was an Israelite. He says, I am an Israelite. And then he says, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. And going back to your previous question, when he says here of the tribe of Benjamin, that is not only a demographic statement, that is a territorial statement. The tribe of Benjamin had a distinctive territory. Now, I don't doubt that Paul had that in mind too. But when you read the 11th chapter of Romans, it's vital to remember you're reading Paul essentially addressing Gentiles. And he's warning them not to mistreat the Jews. He's saying you've got to love them. And then he goes on to conclude, he says, of course, Israel shall be saved. I believe anyone with a prima facie reading of this would agree that when he says all Israel shall be saved, he's speaking of a eschatological saving of the nation of Israel as a whole. But verse 28 this is the climactic key verse for me. In verse 28 of Romans 11, Paul says, and I've written a whole chapter on this 28th verse, Paul says, from the standpoint of the gospel,